Welcome to the Emavira audiobooks. This is The Empty Executor, a Tasmanian noir crime fiction story. A story about a dying man who used the last year of his life to build a trap out of architecture and patience, and the estate administrator he suspected of turning grief itself into a profession. It's a tale of sealed rooms, buried evidence, and the quiet, terrible cost of trusting the wrong calm voice in a room full of people who are still grieving. Let's begin. Arthur Wren's will was read on a bright, cold Launceston morning in the offices of Marr and Associates Estate Administration on St. John Street, and buried among the ordinary bequests of a retired architect's modest estate was a clause that made his 3 adult children look up from their papers in confusion. The room at the eastern end of the second floor of Fairview, the family's Georgian house at Evandale, was to remain sealed for exactly 1 year from the date of his death. No sale, no renovation, nothing could proceed until that room was opened in the presence of his appointed executor and an independent witness, its contents fully documented. The room itself had been a standing family joke for decades. Dad's room. The mystery nobody cared enough to actually solve. Now it wasn't funny at all. Deborah Wren Ashby, the eldest at 51, a hospital administrator who hadn't spoken to her father in 4 years over a bitter disagreement about her divorce, went very still. Marcus, the middle child, whose landscaping business had survived 2 bankruptcies and was quietly limping toward a third, laughed once sharply. Of course there's a sealed room. Bloody typical. And Ruth, the youngest, the only one who'd visited their father regularly in his final years, said nothing at all. Presiding over the reading was Celeste Marr, 50-something, 17 years into a career built on sounding like the last reasonable person in any room full of suspicious, grieving relatives. She reassured the siblings in the calm, unhurried voice that had made her the most trusted estate administrator in the Northern Midlands. Families recommended her to other families the way you'd recommend a doctor who'd saved your life. Eccentric final wishes were more common than people expected, she told them. Their father had simply wanted to control the shape of his own story to the very end. What she did not say, what she had decided, carefully in the drive over, not to say, was that Arthur Wren had told her, 18 months earlier, that the sealed room contained an insurance policy of a rather unusual kind, and had smiled at her in a way that had left her, for one disquieting moment, feeling like the one being assessed rather than the one doing the assessing. She hadn't thought about that smile in months. She thought about it constantly now. Because Celeste Marr was not, in fact, merely a devoted family solicitor's ally. Over 17 years, she had built something considerably darker beneath her reputation for compassion. It began early in her career, watching an Evandale grazier's 3 sons destroy each other and their father's estate over 18 months of vicious probate disputes, legal fees eating away nearly 1/5 of the estate's value, and Celeste, the administrator managing that slow-motion collapse, paid handsomely for every additional month of conflict. She told herself for years that she simply understood families. What actually happened, gradually and then completely, was that she began hunting for the fractures instead of merely noticing them, the overlooked sibling, the undiscussed addiction, the decades-old resentment sitting just under a family's civility. She had given the practice a name, privately, in her own mind, though she had never once spoken it aloud to anyone in 17 years. She called it reading the load, a term borrowed, consciously or not, from the very language of structural engineering that Arthur Wren himself had spent his career working within. It described, with an accuracy that would have unsettled her had she ever let herself examine the parallel too closely, the exact process by which she assessed a new client family, identifying which relationship in a household was carrying the most unacknowledged weight, which one was closest to buckling, and precisely how much additional pressure, applied at exactly the right point, would be required to bring the whole structure down in a way that looked, to any outside observer, like the family's own natural, tragic collapse rather than an engineered one. She used those insights the way a skilled surgeon uses an X-ray, to know exactly where to press. A well-placed comment here, a carefully timed piece of information there, and a family already primed for suspicion would do the rest of the work themselves, turning on one another with an intensity that made even the most obviously natural death look, by the time probate concluded, like the inevitable last chapter of a dysfunction that had clearly been building for years. Nobody thought to look closely at Celeste Marr in those cases, because Celeste Marr was never the one holding the knife, metaphorical or otherwise. She was only ever the calm, reasonable professional standing in the wreckage afterward, offering to make everything simple, the single most effective camouflage available to anyone operating within a profession built on grief. Arthur Wren, a widower of 4 years with an estate worth more than his modest life suggested, 3 children each carrying a separate grievance, and a valuable heritage property that a development consortium had quietly wanted for 2 years, had looked to Celeste like one of her more promising prospects. His late wife had been the family's gardener, and Fairview's beds had gone to careful, deliberate neglect since her death. Neglect Celeste read, at first, as simple grief. It would occur to her much later that an overgrown garden also discouraged casual visitors from wandering close enough to the house's eastern wall to notice anything unusual about its proportions. Fairview itself deserved a moment of its own. It sat on 4 hectares at the edge of Evandale, its wrought iron gates visible from the main road, a 2-story Georgian house built in 1842 by a free settler family whose descendants had, over 6 generations, sold off the surrounding farmland until only the house and its gardens remained, a shrinking island of colonial grandeur inside a district that had filled in around it with newer, plainer houses. Arthur had bought it derelict 30 years earlier as a young architect eager to prove himself, and spent the better part of a decade bringing it back to a condition that eventually earned it a heritage listing and, more usefully to Celeste's professional calculations, a valuation considerably higher than its unassuming street presence suggested. Celeste had walked through that house perhaps a dozen times in the 18 months of her acquaintance with Arthur, cataloging which rooms held which memories, which objects the children might fight over, how quickly a forced sale might need to proceed once probate concluded. She had never once considered that Arthur might be cataloging her in return. What Celeste did not know, walking into Fairview for their very first meeting, was that she was not the first person to identify Arthur Wren as a vulnerable, valuable target. She was simply the first to do so without his full knowledge, because Arthur, in his 39 years as an architect specializing in exactly this kind of heritage restoration, had developed a trained eye for structural weakness, and in his final years he had begun applying that eye to something other than buildings. He had watched his own fractured family, Deborah's anger, Marcus's debts, Ruth's quiet exhaustion, and had come to a troubling conclusion: that a family in this condition was exactly the kind a certain type of professional predator specifically hunted. The suspicion wasn't abstract. A neighbor, an elderly widow named Constance Reed, had vanished from the district under circumstances Arthur found deeply unsatisfying. Her property sold with unusual speed to a buyer nobody in Evandale had ever met, the sale handled by an estate administrator whose warm professionalism Arthur, watching from next door, found he simply couldn't trust. He began making inquiries of his own. And then, with the same patient thoroughness he'd once brought to a difficult restoration brief, he did something considerably bolder. He engaged Celeste Marr not as an unsuspecting mark, but as a deliberate, carefully managed experiment. He fed her exactly the family fractures she seemed hungriest to exploit, and watched, with the detached curiosity of a man conducting a structural stress test, exactly how far she would take it. He told no one, not his children, whose reactions he couldn't risk contaminating, and not fully even his solicitor, though he trusted a sharp young partner named Priya near enough to hint at the shape of his suspicions in their final year of meetings. His training had taught him, across nearly 4 decades of practice, that the most dangerous structural failures were rarely the dramatic, visible ones. A collapsed roof, a cracked foundation any passerby could spot. The failures that actually killed people were the slow, patient ones. A termite colony working quietly through a load-bearing beam for years before anyone thought to check it. He had come to suspect, watching Celeste's careful cultivation of his family's grievances, that he was witnessing exactly this kind of slow structural failure, applied to people instead of buildings, and the recognition unsettled him precisely because it was, in its own way, a form of expertise he almost respected, even as he despised what it was being used to accomplish. He designed, instead, exactly as he had once designed buildings, a structure meant to reveal, under the pressure of his own death, whatever hidden weaknesses in Celeste Marr's operation might otherwise stay buried forever. The sealed room was the culmination of 18 months of that design. What Arthur could not have accounted for, what no architect, however careful, ever fully can, was the possibility that Celeste Marr was not the sole architect of the scheme he believed he was exposing, but only its most visible flaw. 3 months after Arthur's death, Priya Nair was engaged to conduct an independent forensic review of the estate, not by the suspicious Wren children, but by Celeste Marr herself, who recommended it to the family as proof that nobody could later claim the administration had been mishandled. Priya, 34, sharp and methodical, had built her career specifically around the belief that grieving families were too often quietly fleeced by administrators who understood exactly how little scrutiny deceased estates received. She began the review with no particular suspicion of the woman who'd recommended her. For weeks in, she found the first thread of a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Small payments, never individually large enough to trigger an audit flag, routed to blandly named entities: Northern Midlands Property Consulting, Tasmanian Estate Valuations Group, Heritage Asset Review Services. Cross-referencing their registered addresses, she found all 3 shared a single suite number in a Launceston office building, the very same suite as Marr and Associates itself.
She didn't confront Celeste.
She had learned, early in her career, that confronting a suspected fraud before fully documenting it simply gave the fraudster time to clean up the trail, and she spent the following 6 weeks instead building a careful, methodical case, cross-referencing 3 other estates Celeste had administered over 4 years, all fractured families, all showing the same deniable pattern of payments flowing quietly back toward entities connected, however many layers removed, to Celeste's own practice. In the third of these, a Longford grazing family, administered 2 years earlier, she found something far more alarming than misdirected fees: a death, ruled accidental at the time, that correspondence in the file suggested had been actively, deliberately engineered. Donald Pierce, 83, had died falling from a hay loft, the kind of death rural Tasmania saw with grim regularity. But Priya found, in the 6 months before his death, a pattern of letters, one to his elder son mentioning vague, recent conversations about succession, a near-identical letter to the younger son 3 weeks later, timed to land just as the first had already soured relations between the brothers, and a file note recording Celeste's advice to Donald himself to formalize his succession wishes sooner rather than later. Advice that guaranteed he spent his final weeks mediating a manufactured war between his sons instead of living what time he had left in peace. Priya found Donald's elder son, still farming what remained of the property after the dispute forced a sale of half the original land. "I've spent 2 years believing I killed my own father," he told her. "We argued 3 days before he fell, about the will, about everything sitting between my brother and me. I told him he was a coward for not deciding. I've turned that conversation over 10,000 times, wondering if that's why a man his age was up in that loft alone doing a young man's job. He looked at her. You're telling me someone engineered that argument on purpose? I can't prove causation, Priya told him honestly, because it was true, and because she had learned across a career of delivering hard financial truths that false comfort helped no one. I can prove the pattern of correspondence. What that pattern means for how your father actually died is a question for a coroner, not an accountant. But I think you deserve to know the pattern exists, whatever the coroner ultimately decides it means. She did not sleep well the night she first understood what she was looking at. She sat instead at her own kitchen table with the Longford file spread out before her, thinking about a man she had never met, dead 2 years, whose final months had apparently been engineered piece by a woman half the district still considered a saint. An exhumation, ordered months later once Priya's findings reached the wider investigation, would find evidence of a fall complicated by an undocumented dose of a common sedative, not proof on its own, but combined with the engineered conflict, enough to eventually support a graver charge still. Around the same time, Detective Callum Frost, still working the long tail of a case that had consumed 2 years of his life, the parallel criminal network unraveled the year before through Detective Sergeant Talia Reeves' investigation in Bridgewater and the arrest of a man named Gray Cutter, received a call from an accountant he'd never worked with. The intervening 18 months had not been idle ones for Frost. He had testified extensively in the ongoing Cutter proceedings, coordinated with detectives in 3 other states building parallel cases against various arms of the network, and had spent a considerable amount of his own time, well beyond what any case file required, simply reading every coronial report from a rural or regional Tasmanian death in the preceding decade that involved an elderly person and a recently changed will, cross-referencing names and administrators against one another in a private spreadsheet he kept on his own initiative, convinced that the cases he'd already closed represented only a fraction of a much larger pattern still waiting to be mapped. He had begun to suspect, without yet being able to prove it, that Tasmania's small, tightly networked probate industry contained more than one predatory operator working the same fundamental method, and that some of them might be connected to one another through channels older and deeper than any single case file suggested. It was this private, unofficial diligence, more than any specific tip, that left him primed to recognize the significance the moment Priya Nair's name appeared on his call log that Thursday evening. "I've found a pattern of self-dealing across at least 4 estates," Priya told him over coffee, sliding a folder across the table, "and in at least one, a death that deserves far more scrutiny than it got." Asked about Celeste Marr specifically, Priya hesitated. "She's genuinely respected, which is what makes this so hard to credit. If I'm right, she's spent 2 decades building one of the most trusted reputations in the Midlands specifically to exploit it." And Arthur Wren, the case that worried her most, not because the financial pattern was worse, but because of the sealed room. "Every instinct tells me that Claus wasn't written by a confused old man. It reads like a trap, detective. And I don't think Celeste Marr has any idea yet that she's standing in it." The development consortium interested in Fairview, Northern Heritage Developments, presented itself as a respectable heritage property investor. What neither Priya nor Frost yet knew was that it had, over 6 years, acquired 11 heritage properties across the Northern Midlands through remarkably similar circumstances: an elderly owner, a fractured family, a probate process managed by one of a small handful of administrators, Celeste Marr prominent among them, and a sale concluding well below market value. The difference quietly absorbed into fees and delays a grieving family rarely had energy to scrutinize. It was Priya who found the connection, tracing Northern Heritage Development's ownership through 2 layers of corporate structure to a name that meant nothing to her at first glance. G.A. Cutter Holdings, Discretionary Trust. She didn't know she was looking at the residual architecture of a man currently on remand awaiting trial on 31 counts of fraud and conspiracy, but she recognized, with an accountant's trained instinct for unexplained coincidence, that the name couldn't be an accident. She rang Frost that night, later than professional courtesy usually allowed, and read him the name over the phone, and heard, on the other end, a long, startled silence before he finally said, in a voice far more urgent than any he'd used with her before, that she may just have connected 2 investigations that half a dozen very experienced detectives across 3 states had spent 2 years failing to link. He drove to her office at 11 rather than wait for morning, and the 2 of them spent 6 hours working through her spreadsheets side by side, cross-referencing dates, entity names, and transaction patterns until the shape of the connection became undeniable. "He's not running one operation," Frost said, staring at the whiteboard Priya had begun assembling on her own office wall, half accountant's ledger, half detective's case board. "He's running a franchise. Every branch its own recruiter, its own operatives, all built on the same method, all kept ignorant of each other, so catching one branch never leads to the trunk. 2 years of investigators treating each case as an isolated tragedy, and the whole time one person sat above all of it, teaching the same lesson to different students in different towns." Priya had never worked this closely with a police investigation before and found herself, across that long night, unexpectedly grateful for the company. Accounting, in her ordinary practice, was a solitary discipline, numbers examined alone at a desk long after the people who generated them had moved on with their lives. "Then let's make sure this is the last time anyone in this state has to learn it the hard way," she said, and turned back to her spreadsheets with a stubborn focus that would prove instrumental in finally cracking the case open completely. Over the following month, Frost's task force mapped the full 11 property acquisition history, elderly or vulnerable owners across Evandale, Longford, Perth, Hadspen, and the wider Tamar Valley, each story fading quietly into the background of ordinary rural loss before the next began. The first property, acquired 6 years earlier, had belonged to a retired schoolteacher in Hadspen whose son described a helpful young estate consultant, not Celeste Marr, but a woman using a different name entirely, never subsequently identified, who had eased his mother through a difficult probate following his father's death, only for the mother herself to die 18 months later in circumstances the family had simply accepted, at the time, as the sad but unremarkable consequence of grief and advancing age. The second and third properties followed a similar shape before Celeste Marr's name first appeared in the trail at all, administering the estate of a Perth grazier whose family dispute over water rights bore all the hallmarks of her particular method: patient cultivation of an existing grievance, a slow escalation timed to coincide with declining health, and a sale that concluded, once probate finally settled, at roughly 60% of what an open market process would likely have achieved. "It's not greed in the way most fraud is greed," Priya told Frost, laying the full 11 property timeline across a conference table at the task force's temporary Launceston offices. "Greed usually rushes. This is something closer to farming. Patient, seasonal, willing to wait years for a harvest, because whoever built it understood that patience was the one resource a properly resourced police investigation would never be able to match." Frost turned that description over for a long time afterward, against everything else he had learned chasing different branches of the same underlying structure, an image of the whole operation as something closer to agriculture than crime, tended and harvested across years by people who had each, in their own damaged or calculating way, learned to think of loneliness itself as a renewable resource. Fairview, the 11th property, would become the first the scheme ever failed to acquire, thanks entirely to Arthur Wren's own quiet counterdesign, a single successful defense in a pattern of otherwise unbroken success. Frost's interviews with the 3 Wren children revealed none of them had known, consciously, what their father had been building. Deborah described a string of strange phone calls in his final year, odd questions about whether she trusted her solicitor, whether she'd ever met Celeste Marr before the will reading. "I thought he was becoming paranoid," she said, her composure fraying. "I think he was trying to warn me, and I was too angry to listen." Marcus, defensive at first, admitted he'd assumed his father's late questions about his finances were simple disapproval of his failed businesses, not a check on whether he was vulnerable to exactly what had apparently happened. "He was trying to protect me, and I thought he was just being a controlling old bastard about money." Frost had interviewed enough grieving families by that point in his career to recognize the particular texture of genuine surprise, and he came away from all 3 separate Wren interviews increasingly convinced that none of the siblings had known, in any conscious way, that their father had spent his final 18 months quietly building a case against the woman entrusted with settling his affairs. It was a detail that would matter a great deal to the eventual prosecution, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that Arthur's design had been entirely his own, uninfluenced by any of his children. It was Ruth who supplied the missing piece. "He asked me, about a year before he died, whether I'd help him with something and not tell my siblings," she told Frost. "I said yes, obviously. We were close. We'd always been close. He gave me an envelope, told me to put it somewhere safe and not open it unless something happened to him that felt wrong. I mostly forgot about it, if I'm honest, because nothing about his death felt wrong at the time. It felt sad and it felt sudden, but it didn't feel wrong. Should I have opened it sooner?" A year before his death, Arthur had asked her to keep an envelope, unopened, unless something about his death ever felt wrong, and she had nearly forgotten it in her safety deposit box. Retrieved and opened the following morning, it read, in Arthur's careful architect's hand, "If you are reading this, something has gone further than I intended. I do not believe Celeste Marr means any of us physical harm. Her methods are financial, not violent. But I have learned she is not operating alone, and I no longer feel certain how far the structure above her extends. Trust Priya Nair. If Fairview's finances are ever formally reviewed, trust the sealed room to tell you what I could not safely put in writing anywhere else. And forgive me, all 3 of you, for not trusting any of you enough to explain this while I still could." The room was opened exactly a year and a week after Arthur's death, the extra week spent securing a court order to ensure the opening happened under police supervision rather than Celeste Marr's alone, a development that visibly unsettled her for the first time since the estate's probate had begun. What they found, when the old brass lock was finally cut, was almost anticlimactic: a small study, a desk, a filing cabinet, and one wall entirely covered in architectural drawings, not of Fairview, but of an unfamiliar house, annotated in Arthur's careful hand with measurements, load calculations, and a private column of dates spanning nearly 2 years. "It's a cavity wall," Priya said, studying it. "Look at the measurements. He's built in a discrepancy. There's a gap in this house somewhere, detective, and I don't think it's an accident." It took a locksmith and a structural engineer a full afternoon to locate the corresponding cavity, not in the sealed room at all, which Frost now understood had been a deliberate misdirection, a puzzle box designed to draw attention while the true evidence sat elsewhere. Inside Fairview's eastern wall, wrapped in oilcloth against 18 months of damp, was a second box. Photographs Arthur had taken himself, with a modest telephoto lens, of Celeste Marr meeting 4 times over 18 months with a well-dressed, silver-haired man neither investigator immediately recognized. "That's him," Frost said quietly, staring at the 4th photograph. That's Gray Cutter. Arthur Wren photographed a man on remand in Adelaide meeting his own estate administrator 11 months before his own death, and built an entire architectural puzzle to make sure someone eventually found it. The rest of the box filled in the picture. Bank statements tracing small payments from Celeste's account to the same shell entities Priya had already found, a hand-drawn timeline mapping Celeste's visits against the family's grievances, and at the bottom, a sealed letter addressed to whichever investigator eventually found it. "Whoever you are, thank you for taking this seriously enough to find it," it read. "I am an old man who spent his career making sure buildings could bear the weight placed on them, and it seemed to me the least I owed my family was to identify where that weight was coming from before I ran out of time to do anything useful about it." The investigation widened quickly from there. Priya traced Northern Heritage Development's filings to the case of Constance Reed, Arthur's own vanished neighbor, alive but diminished in a poorly regulated care facility outside Devonport, placed there by a family representative nobody could name. "A very kind young man started visiting," she told investigators, her memory patchy, but her confusion plain. "He said he could help me manage my affairs, since my family were all so far away. I don't actually have family in Queensland, detective. I don't know why everyone kept saying that." Her case revealed a blunter method sitting alongside the network's more sophisticated operations: isolate, medicate, relocate, and let an under-resourced and poorly regulated private care system absorb the resulting confusion without ever asking the hard questions a functioning oversight regime should have asked years earlier. Frost added her case and 4 others like it that surfaced in the following months, once investigators knew what pattern to search for, to a growing file that made increasingly clear just how many different methods, operating in parallel across the state, ultimately traced back to the same patient, adaptable architecture. There was, too, a quieter and sadder thread that Frost's task force turned up almost by accident. Gerald Fenn, a solicitor still practicing in New Norfolk, who had, 12 years earlier, briefly mentored a sharp, ambitious young solicitor's clerk during a rotation placement, a young woman named Celeste Marr, before she left legal practice entirely to build her own estate administration business. "I remember her clearly," Fenn told Frost over the phone, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had learned, in 2 years, considerably more than he ever wanted to know about how his own profession could be turned against the people it was meant to protect. "Bright, meticulous, asked good questions, the kind that told you she was thinking 2 steps ahead of the file in front of her. I didn't realize, watching her leave for a role with rather less oversight and considerably more discretion than a solicitor's office would ever allow, what she'd eventually put that discretion to use doing. It was, Frost had come to believe, one of the network's quietest and most corrosive effects, not merely the direct harm inflicted on its victims, but the slow, retrospective poisoning of ordinary trust across an entire professional community, as decent mentors, colleagues, and neighbors were forced to reckon with how close they had once unknowingly stood to something they'd had no reason, at the time, to suspect. What emerged, in the following weeks, was a structure larger than either investigator had understood. Cutter's network hadn't relied only on young, disposable operatives like Mara Voss. It had also cultivated a smaller, more exclusive tier of established professionals who needed no invented identity, because their own genuine reputations already provided the cover. Celeste Marr, interviewed at length, eventually admitted, without anything resembling remorse, that she'd been approached by Cutter's organization almost a decade earlier as an established professional offered a straightforward proposition: a percentage of inflated fees and diverted proceeds, in exchange for identifying which of her clients' families were fractured enough to tolerate exactly the kind of drawn-out administration that maximized her return. "I never manufactured a single family's dysfunction," she told Frost, in the one interview she gave before her solicitor advised silence. Every fracture I exploited already existed. I only ever made choices about which wound to press and when. If you want to prosecute someone for the underlying disease, detective, you're welcome to try prosecuting every difficult family in the state for failing to love each other properly. It was, Frost thought, a genuinely revealing statement, not because it excused anything, but because it showed exactly how the whole structure had operated undetected for so long. Nobody involved, at any level, believed they had originated the harm. Gray Cutter himself, deposed by video link from custody, was unnervingly calm discussing it. Celeste approached us. If you want the precise history, he said. I don't recruit respected professionals the way I recruit young, desperate ones. Respected professionals recruit themselves. Once they've noticed an opportunity nobody else in their industry is willing to name aloud. Asked whether he felt responsible for Arthur Wren's death, he was almost plaintive. I never met Arthur Wren. I would prefer not to be blamed for a man's death I had no direct part in arranging. Watching the recording afterward, Priya asked Frost whether he thought Cutter was telling the truth, or had simply found the one remaining currency worth trading, the appearance of total honesty, offered strategically, precisely because it was the version of himself least likely to earn him any further charges beyond what was already proven. He talks about all of it like a supply chain, Frost said. Recruitment, training, distribution. I don't think he's ever once used a word suggesting he understands what any of it costs the people underneath it. He found himself thinking, in the days afterward, about the strange asymmetry running through the whole network, how operatives like Mara Voss and Elias Ferris, doing the most visible, personal harm, carried an obvious, legible cruelty that juries and journalists could easily condemn, while men like Cutter, sitting comfortably above the entire structure, could describe their role in language so bloodlessly administrative that it became almost difficult to remember that actual people had died because of decisions he'd made from the safety of an office chair. Frost raised the observation some weeks later in a debrief with a newly formed statewide task force and found it met with grim, general recognition around the table. It was Talia Reeve, joining by video link from Bridgewater, who finally named what all of them had independently begun to suspect. It's not just a method being taught, she said. It's a whole belief system, passed down alongside the practical training, that the harm was always already there, waiting, and that the person who finally exploits it is somehow less culpable than the family who let the wound develop in the first place. It's a very convenient philosophy for someone building a criminal enterprise, and I think whoever originated it understood exactly how useful it would prove in keeping their operatives compliant. I don't think he's capable of understanding any of that, Priya added later. I think that's rather the point of him, detective. Some people build these structures because they've been damaged into believing there's no other way to survive. He built his because he genuinely, comfortably believes this is simply how the world works, and he was clever enough to profit from being right about that more consistently than most people ever let themselves admit. It's a much harder thing to prosecute in the end. A damaged person can be rehabilitated, at least in theory. I'm not sure what a court is meant to do with someone who is never damaged at all, only ever comfortable. Ruth Wren asked Frost, in the quiet weeks after Celeste's arrest made the front page for 3 days running, the question sitting behind everything else. Why didn't he just come to the police himself the moment he suspected something? Frost's answer came easily. At the start, all he had was a feeling. That's not enough to bring to a busy police force, however correct the instinct proves. He needed evidence, and evidence like this only accumulates slowly. I think he also understood that being believed requires more than being right. He'd have known, as an architect, that a skeptical client is only convinced once you show them the actual crack, not just describe where you suspect one might be. Celeste Marr was charged, for months after the wall cavity's discovery, with fraud, forgery and conspiracy spanning 4 estates and 11 properties, her case formally linked to the ongoing multi-state prosecution of Gray Cutter. The Longford death, once exhumation confirmed the undocumented sedative, was reclassified from accidental to suspicious, adding a graver charge still. The trial opened in the Launceston Supreme Court that autumn and ran 5 weeks, shorter than the sprawling multi-state proceedings against Gray Cutter, still grinding forward in 3 separate jurisdictions, but no less closely watched by a community that had trusted Celeste Marr with more of its private grief than any single professional reasonably should have been trusted with. Media interest built steadily across the 5 weeks, fueled by the case's unmistakable echoes of an already well-publicized prosecution from the previous year, enough that the presiding judge issued an early reminder to the jury to consider only the evidence heard in her own courtroom. Legal commentators would later describe the Wren case as the moment Tasmania's legal and accounting professions began, in earnest, to reckon with a form of fraud traditional oversight had never been built to catch, one that operated not through forged documents, but through the patient, entirely legal cultivation of exactly the kind of professional trust an aging, increasingly isolated population had no realistic alternative but to extend. Priya's forensic accounting formed the backbone of the Crown's case, for estates worth of meticulously reconstructed payment trails across 11 days of testimony that left even Celeste's own solicitor, according to courtroom observers, visibly resigned to the outcome well before closing arguments began. The Crown called 11 witnesses across the 5 weeks. Constance Reed testified by video link from her care facility, her account halting and occasionally confused but devastating in its plain, unrehearsed honesty about a system that had let a lonely, cognitively declining woman sign away her home to strangers without a single professional along the way pausing to ask whether she understood what she was doing. Donald Pierce's elder son testified for the better part of a day about the exhumation, about 2 years spent believing he'd argued his own father into a fatal accident, about the particular, specific relief and horror of learning the argument itself had been engineered by a woman he'd trusted to handle his father's affairs with care. Deborah, Marcus, and Ruth Wren each gave evidence in turn, their accounts remarkably consistent in describing a woman who had, across 18 months, learned every fracture in their family with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of someone building a structure rather than simply administering an estate. Celeste's defense argued she'd committed no act any family member could point to with certainty, every fee technically disclosed, every piece of advice defensible on its own narrow terms. It gained real traction for several days, until the Crown recalled Priya Nair to walk the court through 11 years of financial patterns spanning 4 estates, 3 states, and 1 clearly documented conspiracy, with a man facing 31 charges in another courtroom entirely. It was, by common agreement, the single most consequential afternoon of the trial. Celeste's defense, led by one of Launceston's most experienced criminal barristers, argued throughout that she had committed no act of fraud any individual family member could point to with certainty, that every fee was technically disclosed, every payment nominally justified, every piece of advice defensible on its own narrow terms, and that the Crown's case relied on inference and pattern rather than any single, unambiguous act of theft. It was a sophisticated argument, and for several days it appeared to be gaining real traction with at least some portion of the jury, until the Crown, in its final week, called Priya Nair back to the stand to walk the court, methodically and without a single wasted word, through 11 years of financial patterns spanning 4 estates, 3 states, and 1 clearly documented conspiracy, with a man currently facing 31 separate charges in an entirely different courtroom. It was, several courtroom observers noted afterward, the single most consequential afternoon of testimony in the entire trial. Celeste Marr received 19 years, with a non-parole period of 13, the judge noting in her sentencing remarks that the court had rarely encountered a case in which professional trust, the specific, hard-won trust a community extends to those who care for its dying and its dead, had been so thoroughly and deliberately weaponized. Celeste showed no visible reaction, sitting with the same calm, composed stillness she'd maintained through every stage of the proceedings. Frost watched from the gallery, thinking of another woman's identical stillness in another courtroom the year before, and wondering, not for the first time, how many more calm, trusted professionals were still operating undetected somewhere in the same architecture. He left the courthouse without any particular sense of triumph, only the sober, familiar knowledge that closing one file rarely means closing the underlying wound, and drove back to his office to begin, once again, the patient work of tracing whatever thread might still be waiting to be found. Along the way, largely as a matter of her own thoroughness rather than any specific instruction, Priya traced one final, unsettling thread, an obscure trust buried in Northern Heritage Development's historical filings, 3 years old, briefly active before being dissolved, its sole listed beneficiary a name that meant nothing on its own, D.R. Voss, until Priya cross-referenced it against press coverage of an already concluded Tasmanian prosecution and recognized the surname. Voss, the same as Mara Voss, the young operative behind the very first branch of this network anyone had ever cracked open. "It's not the same woman," she told Frost carefully. "The dates don't work. Mara Voss was already in custody when this trust was active. But the surname isn't a coincidence, detective, not in an organization this deliberately structured. I think Diane may be a relative. A mother, an aunt, someone considerably further up whatever family or mentorship structure produced Mara Voss in the first place." Frost sat with that for a long time, staring at a case board that had grown over 2 years, from a single suspicious death into something far larger and more organized than any individual investigator had originally suspected, a structure with roots, it now seemed, running back at least a generation. He did not find Diane. Nobody did, not that year, not for a long time afterward. But he added her name, carefully, to a case file he understood, closing it that evening, was very far from actually closed, merely quiet, for now, the way a fire left unattended sometimes goes quiet without ever being properly put out. A year after the wall cavity's contents had been fully documented, Ruth Wren stood in the doorway of what had once been her father's sealed study, now stripped back to bare plaster as part of a careful restoration she'd taken on herself, funded by an estate finally, correctly administered by a small independent firm with no connection to Northern Heritage Developments or anyone like it. In the months after Celeste Marr's arrest, the 3 Wren siblings did something that surprised even themselves. They began, haltingly and without any particular grand reconciliation scene, to actually speak to one another again, not as the polished, distant family Arthur had watched fracture over years of missed birthdays and unresolved grievances, but as 3 adults who had discovered, together, that their father's final, elaborate act of care had required each of them to hold a separate piece of a puzzle none of them could have solved alone. It began with something almost absurdly small, a group message chain Ruth started 3 weeks after the arrest, initially just to coordinate logistics around the police investigation and the eventual restoration of Fairview, which slowly, without any of them quite deciding it should, expanded to include ordinary things, a photograph of Deborah's daughter's school project on heritage architecture, a complaint from Marcus about a difficult client, a memory Ruth had of their mother she'd never thought to share with either of them before. Deborah, whose divorce and the argument it caused with their father had sat at the center of the family's estrangement for 4 years, was the one who finally proposed, 6 months after the trial concluded, that the 3 of them meet properly, in person, simply as siblings, for the first time in longer than any of them cared to calculate. I kept thinking, during the trial, about how much Dad must have agonized over which of us to trust with which piece of the puzzle, Deborah told Frost at a case closure interview conducted well after sentencing, her voice carrying an emotion that hadn't been present in their earlier, more guarded conversations. And I realized I'd spent 4 years assuming he simply didn't think about me at all, once we stopped speaking. It turns out he thought about all of us constantly, right up until the end. He just didn't know how to say any of it directly anymore, so he built an elaborate architectural puzzle instead, because that was the language he actually trusted himself to speak fluently. She managed something that was almost a laugh. It's a very Dad way to say I love you, in retrospect. Infuriating and completely, unmistakably him. She added, more quietly, that she didn't think it was an accident that Arthur had designed the whole scheme so that no single one of his children could ever have finished it alone. The sealed room, the envelope, the wall cavity, each piece meaningless without the others, exactly the way none of the 3 of them had ever really been whole without each other either. The restoration itself became, in its own way, a kind of family therapy none of the 3 siblings would have signed up for on purpose. Marcus, his business finally stable, took charge of the gardens, restoring Arthur's original plantings from old nursery receipts. Deborah handled the administrative side, drawing on 2 decades of hospital management experience. Ruth, living in the house now, made the final calls on anything contentious, a role the others ceded to her, as though some unspoken family logic had decided that the sibling who'd stayed closest to their father in his final years had earned the right to be closest to whatever came after him. Deborah and Marcus visited most weekends now, an arrangement none of them had explicitly negotiated, so much as simply, gradually fallen back into. Deborah brought her teenage daughter, who'd never known her grandfather and had become fascinated by his architectural drawings, spreading them across the dining table and asking questions about load-bearing walls that made Ruth think some essential piece of Arthur Wren had survived his own death after all. Ruth had, in those same months, taken to keeping her own small notebook of the house's history, interviewing elderly Evandale residents who remembered her father's original restoration decades earlier, photographing each room as it emerged from the latest stage of work, building, in her own quiet way, an archive not unlike the one her father had once built against Celeste Marr, except that hers was constructed out of love rather than suspicion, meant to be shared rather than hidden. It was during that same restoration, when a contractor pulled up the original floorboards of the study, that they found something unrelated to the fraud entirely, a small metal box tucked into a shallow recess Arthur had evidently built decades earlier, containing nothing more dramatic than a handful of old family photographs and a single folded letter addressed to all 3 children together. It had clearly been placed there years before the scheme against Celeste Marr had ever been conceived, a much older, gentler piece of her father's private architecture, and Ruth found herself weeping over it in a way the case's entire dramatic unraveling had never quite managed to produce, not at the discovery of a crime, but at the discovery of an ordinary, uncomplicated tenderness that had been sitting quietly beneath the house the whole time, waiting for someone to finally lift the right
Floorboard.
Do you think he knew it would end like this? Marcus asked one Sunday, standing in the restored study. Not the arrest.
Us.
This. He gestured at the 3 of them, at the house that had, against every calculation the consortium had made about its future, stayed exactly where it always belonged, in the family's hands, restored rather than sold. I don't think he could have known, Ruth said slowly. I think he hoped. I think that's probably the most any of us ever get to do, when we're trying to protect the people we love from something we can't fully explain yet. You build what you can, as carefully as you can, and you hope the people you've built it for are strong enough, in the end, to finish understanding it without you. She closed the study door gently behind them, not sealed anymore, not hiding anything anymore, simply a room in a house that had finally become exactly what her father had meant it to be. Not a trap and not a puzzle, but an inheritance, open now to anyone in the family who cared to walk through it. It became, in time, Ruth's favorite room, the one she chose for her own quiet reading in the evenings. She kept a single framed print of the wall cavity diagram on the desk where her father's evidence had once sat hidden, not as a memorial to the fraud it exposed, but as a reminder that he had spent his final year proving, in the most Arthur Wren way imaginable, that love and vigilance were the same careful, patient discipline wearing two different names. Priya Nair kept a copy of those drawings pinned above her own desk for years afterward, a reminder of the lesson the case had taught her, that the most dangerous frauds rarely announce themselves through forged documents or crude theft, but operated entirely within the bounds of technical legality, one plausible decision at a time, until 100 small, individually reasonable choices added up to something no single decision could ever be prosecuted for alone. Detective Callum Frost requested and received a transfer the following year to a newly formed statewide task force charged with investigating exactly this kind of cross-jurisdictional, professionally embedded fraud, a task force whose founding charter opened with a line he'd borrowed, with permission from Talia Reeve. Some cases don't close. They simply move to a different town, waiting for someone to notice the pattern in time. He kept the name Diane, still unattached to any confirmed identity, at the top of the task force's active list for the whole of his tenure leading it, a quiet, stubborn insistence that the architecture behind Cutter, behind Celeste Marr, behind every operative and professional collaborator the state's courts had so far managed to convict, had not yet been fully dismantled, and would not be, until someone finally found the person who had first taught it how to grow. And there we leave Fairview, its sealed room open at last, its family whole again, and one more thread of a much larger, patient conspiracy still waiting somewhere out in the dark for the right investigator to pull it. Thank you so much for spending time with the Empty Executor. Until the next story finds you, take care of yourselves and maybe check what's behind any locked doors in your own family history.